Joe. Mr. Commissioner, for the record again, Hugh McCauley for the Government of Canada. I understand that Counsel for the Government of British Columbia has a matter to raise with you, and I defer to her.
Mr. Commissioner, Callan, C-A-L-L-A-N, initials T-E, appearing on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen and Ray, the Province of British Columbia. An issue has arisen with respect to the December 8, 2010 order that the province may need to seek clarification on in the next little while. We hope to be able to discuss it first with our friends and at the next all-council meeting, although I understand Mr. Blair won't be available, so we might have to discuss alternative dates. And we'll try to seek some sort of agreement on the issue. However, it's likely that we might have to address it down the road in front of yourself. And this issue isn't respect to the fish health database. We expect to be able to comply with that component of the order. The issues arising with respect to the fish necropsy orders. So basically, when a fish dies in the province and one of the veterinarians is interested in diagnosing what occurred to this particular fish, they send it to the Animal Health Center. And we are going to be producing the electronic records, but there are some paper documents that form the basis of what ultimately becomes the electronic documents, and the province will likely be seeking clarification on whether those are included in the order.
Mr. Commissioner, just briefly, Alan Blair, appearing for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. I've had discussions with the provincial council as well as the federal council on the issue of our collective document production for today, and I understand what the issue is. The discussion can certainly go ahead on Tuesday in my absence. My junior will be here, and I've indicated what our position would be on the issue of clarification. So the discussion can go ahead on Tuesday in my absence. A meaningful discussion amongst all of the council would have to occur in another day, but my assistant will be able to outline what our client's view is with respect to the clarification the province seeks. Thank you.
I don't want to take up valuable time from this hearing. I just want to go on record that I have had some discussions with my colleagues from the province, Mr. Prowse predominantly, who has indicated that they have found a realm of paper documents and requested that I take a position with respect to the production of those paper documents. And reading your order for production of the records, it does not make a distinction between electronic records and paper records. So I took the position that the paper records ought to be produced as well, in the interest of having as fulsome a record as we can. And I will raise this with other council at the meeting, but I think that relates to the issue that, at least insofar as I've been apprised of it, that relates to the issue with respect to the documents.
Mr. Grote and Mr. Rosenberger, before we broke, I was asking you about contributions made through the IHPC process by the participant groups, and just for the sake of completeness, and it's important that we are complete on this. Mr. Grote, I think you alluded to the recreational sector in passing in some of your comments about contributions from the commercial sector, but to both of you, what contributions in terms of improvements to the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries have been made by the recreational sector through their representatives on the SFAB?
The SFAB got a substantial consultation process for bringing in feedback from local committees up into the sub-regional or southern board, and then into the main board of the SFAB. These views are brought forward to both the IHPC and also to the Fraser River panel, and so we would have input from the SFAB as part of the IHPC process from the SFAB.
And the same question in terms of input and changes, improvements that have been made to the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries from the MCC, the Marine Conservation Caucus, representing environmental groups. Could you comment on that?
I think the MCC representatives at the IHPC have been effective at bringing their views forward on the management of Fraser sockeye. They've asked for and received presentations on the implementation of the wild salmon policy, and they have views that they're able to share with the other representatives at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee. The department does also try and arrange a separate meeting with the group to go over the IFMP each year as well. So they're active participants at the IHPC process.
Thank you. I indicated in my introductory comments to some questions touching on some DFO policies and initiatives and how they are reflected in or how they influence the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries. These questions are going to be general and high level in keeping with the nature of your testimony. The first topic area I'd like to ask you about is the Salmonid Enhancement Program, and there will be testimony at later hearings regarding enhancement, generally speaking. But the Salmonid Enhancement Program, or SEP as it's often known, could you describe for Mr. Commissioner, just in general terms, what that's about and its relevance for Fraser sockeye?
Yeah, the Salmon Enhancement Program is rather large in BC in a lot of different places, but as far as sockeye is concerned, there's not a lot of enhancement around the sockeye pink populations. The significant broader components are work that's been done on passage over the years, which is very significant. Things of like Hell's Gate fish ladders, and so there's a number of different fish ladders in key constriction areas, passage problem areas along the Fraser and/or tributaries. There's also 4 spawning channels that are active today. They're on relatively small systems. But that's not they're relatively small on the systems that they're on. So one's on Medina, Weaver, the Cornell, and Gates Creek. There were a couple of other ones that we've didn't find effective and so no longer use. But a key thing on salmon enhancement in recent years has been the work on cultus. So the cultus sockeye problem, both the more traditional enhancement and in the case of taking eggs and raising fry or smolts and releasing them, as well as during the period of very, very high pre-spawn and en-route mortalities that were up in the 90% range. So this is some of the work that's occurred with the early migration timing. We initiated a captive brood program, and so we've held adults through their whole life history to be able to make sure that we maintained genetic diversity, but also maintain the population. So in the case of cultus, the Salmon Enhancement Program has been a significant component of that rebuilding strategy.
Just picking up, Mr. Rosenberger, on cultus sockeye, from a fisheries management perspective, why is rebuilding cultus sockeye so important?
Well, it's a conservation unit, so it's a distinct population. And the wild salmon policy, as well as the overall objectives of the department, are trying to maintain maximum diversity and population size and structures. So it's important to have diversity of all populations, given climate changes or anything that's, the fish need to adapt to. You're looking to try to have the maximum base, and so every population has a degree of importance in that.
If I could, on the points Barry was making about the cultus sockeye recovery, our enhancement staff have worked very closely with first the recovery team and then the conservation team for cultus sockeye. They've done a substantive amount of work in the release strategies of the sockeye that they've released into cultus Lake. So Barry alluded to the captive broodstock program, which is eggs collected from adults and reared to adulthood entirely in the hatchery before their offspring are released. But there's also been an enhancement component as well, which are more conventional hatchery production where you release fry or smolts. And they've done quite a bit of work on marking those juveniles that they've been releasing to assess what the appropriate release strategy should be. So the initial thinking was that it was important to produce smolts. But more recent work has shown that you can get higher production by having a release strategy of fall fry, for example, going out into the lake. They've also worked closely on the recovery team to try and maximize the genetic diversity of the population. So they've done quite a bit of novel work around the matrix models used to ensure that they're not doing damage to the population in a genetic sense from the sorts of mating strategies that they're using in the hatchery as well. So it's been a very integrated part of the team's activities.
Mr. Rudd, I just want to pick up on something that you referred to in one of your earlier responses. I think you were referring to this. Could you describe the cultist sockeye structured decision-making process, or the structured decision-making process that was applied to cultist sockeye? And perhaps, as a preface to your response, for those of us who aren't familiar with structured decision-making processes, if you could just describe what that is and then how it was applied to cultists.
Right, so I did refer to this, an example of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee trying to work together on a common problem. So we had cultist sockeye, which was a stock of concern. It had been recently listed by COSUIC as endangered, and the department was working on developing recovery actions for this population. There were strong divergent opinions at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee about what level of harvest might be appropriate for the population, from very low levels to with the Marine Conservation Caucus and some First Nations supporting, up to much more substantial harvest, which was a view that the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board had. We embarked upon a structured decision-making process, which is essentially, and it was with the assistance of an external consulting group. And it was a way to try and structure the interests of the parties and evaluate those using a rigorous framework. So there's a number of steps, from clearly outlining what the purpose was for the activities, the objectives you might use to assess it. Then it moved into constructing alternative management actions, or collections of actions that people thought would be important from different levels of harvest, but it also was able to look at activities in cultists, like, for example, removing predators, or perhaps removing milfoil in the lake, and also the enhancement activities, and then using a model to assess the potential performance of those. And then the process essentially tried to work down the options, taking into account uncertainties, to see if the group could find some common ground. So they weren't able to get all the way to a final recommendation on what might be done, but they were able to identify elements of common ground, which led to some further work between the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board and First Nations further out in the Fraser Valley.
Could you describe what DFO's objectives are in terms of rebuilding cultists, and whether or not they're being met?
The objectives for cultist sockeye were originally developed by the recovery team that was put together under the auspices of the Species at Risk Act. When the cultist sockeye were not listed under the Act, the work of the recovery team was picked up and summarized in a conservation strategy for cultist sockeye. There were a number of nested objectives for the population, with two key objectives dealing with low abundance. One is to ensure the population has an average population size of about 1,000, with no fewer than 500 in any given year. The second objective related to trying to grow the population over time, and we wanted to see generational growth in the population across 4 years. And certainly looking at the historical data for cultists, when you've had 3 of the 4 cycle lines growing, the population has grown overall. So some indicators for that objective. The third objective related to improving the classification of cultists from endangered to a less threatened category. The group was not able to come to agreement on sort of a 4th level objective, which might be a broader level of abundance for the population, although the report that the group did lay out a number of different metrics you might look at to try and assess that. In terms of performance of the population, 2010 is an example where we looked, given the much larger abundance of salmon returning this year, we did go back and look at the likelihood of meeting the recovery objectives, and in particular recovery objective 1 and 2. And based on the scenarios we looked at, we thought that we could meet objectives 1 and 2, and in particular we calculated how many effective spawners we thought we would need. We looked at the pre-spawn mortality, so fish that had made it up to Cultus Lake but had not survived to spawn in the recent decade, and we determined how many fish we thought we needed to get to the Cultus Lake fence consistent with those recovery objectives. Based on that, there was a decision and a briefing of the minister in season to provide some additional flexibility over the objectives that were laid out in the IFMP.
Thank you. Before we leave Cultus sockeye, I just would ask that the harvest management policy and practice report, number 5, I guess it is, be brought up. And if I could take you, Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, to page 112, specifically the column that provides the exploitation rate for Cultus sockeye from 2009 and years before. My purpose in asking you this question is just really to flag that there's an issue here with respect to some of these calculations. Some of the numbers, as you'll note, are large. We will come back with other witnesses to delve into some of these numbers, but perhaps Mr. Rosenberger, could you just describe some of the issues around the calculation of the Cultus exploitation rate? These numbers, by the way, come from, as I understand it, from the PPR. They come from the Pacific Salmon Commission. But if you could just describe sort of the issues around the calculations.
Well, there's two things for me. One is that the column furthest to the right under Cultus percent, those are not the numbers that we use from the Pacific Salmon Commission data as far as Fraser panel work, or not provided by the department. So there's an inconsistency of information, I think, being exchanged here. On specifically to some of the data, in 2008, as an example I'd use, the 71% exploitation is not the exploitation rate, again, that the Pacific Salmon Commission data sets that I rely on and work, and our tech group relies on. I think the number is in the 14% range. And the difference in this one, in some discussions with some of the people trying to understand, is that the fish that were harvested, or that in this case the Salmon Commission considered to be harvested, were fish that were taken from the fence, so those fish that returned terminally as potential spawners and were used as part of the salmon enhancement program. So fish that were either taken for part of the captive brood or for part of the more normal hatchery operations were removed from the potential spawner counts and added to the harvest side of things, and in low return years is why some of those numbers are higher. There's also data problems in this calculation on the sheet in some of these years where we've described to some degree, and I'm sure others have, on the en route mortality, which is the difference between estimates that we calculate. In this case, the Cultus stock was calculated at the same time as Weaver, but they made a decision, as I understand it from the Salmon Commission staff, that there wasn't any, that difference between estimates should be all accounted against Weaver and not against Cultus. So in this case, they've overestimated the impacts to one population and under to another one. But this is not the data sets that we use in the process within the Fraser panel decision-making process, and the recovery team that Jeff noted spent considerable time trying to come to a best set of data for their purposes, and so that's also available through they've made 2 reports, but the underlying data sets that they have, so that there's a number of places where we could provide other data sets that would be different than this one, but hopefully would provide clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenberger. That's very helpful, and as I say, we'll come back. Mr. Grout, did you have something?
I'd maybe just add a couple of observations to what Barry said. I mean, one thing you do see, the discrepancies aside that Barry's mentioned, is that in the recent decade, as part of the recovery activities for Cultus sockeye, we have made substantial reductions in the exploitation rates on that population. It might be also useful to point out that in season, when we're managing these stocks, we're using, because Cultus sockeye are so infrequently sampled, given their low abundance in the fisheries. We are assessing the exploitation rate on cultus using a proxy from the late run group to do that.
Thank you. I'd like to, as indicated earlier, seek your various DFO policies and initiatives and how they influence or reflected in the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries. One is, and I'd ask that Exhibit 266 be brought up. DFO's policy for selective fishing in Canada's Pacific fisheries. If you could just describe in general terms what this policy is about and how it is implemented in terms of the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries.
Well, maybe I'll start, and Barry might have something to add here, but the policy for selective fishing has guided our management around the fisheries. You'll see, similar to the wild salmon policy, conservation is the top priority here in terms of the principles, and it's trying to move our fisheries to ways that can either avoid harvests of stocks of concern, either through time or area closures, or avoid them through uses of specific gear, or if in cases where we can't do that, the fish can be released unharmed either at the water before they're landed or through techniques on the vessels themselves. It does indicate there'll be increasing movement to more selective fisheries, and that can affect potential opportunities moving forward. In terms of how we operationalize the policy, it's directly related to how we manage a number of our fisheries, especially for Fraser sockeye. We're keeping an idea or a sense of the potential bycatch implications on other stocks that are present when we're fishing for Fraser sockeye. So coho, interior Fraser coho is an example, where we're making assessments of potential mortalities on those stocks in the fisheries that are directed at Fraser River sockeye. And we're keeping a tabulation in the south coast of our overall management objective of 3% exploitation on coho, using a spreadsheet model that tracks release mortality rates and impacts on those stocks in the various different fisheries.
A very similar question regarding DFO's allocation policy for Pacific salmon, and that's already been marked as Exhibit 264. If we could just bring that up so people can remember what it looks like. Again, just if you could describe in very general terms that policy and how it's implemented in the management of Fraser sockeye fisheries.
This policy is a key document in how we manage our salmon resources. And Fraser sockeye is no exception here. It outlines the key principles for how we're going to manage, with conservation as the top priority. After conservation, we've got First Nations harvest for food, social, and ceremonials. Fisheries is having priority over all other uses. It acknowledges the common property nature of the resource. And then it speaks to the allocation for the recreational fishery, which is a priority for Chinook and coho relative to commercial fisheries. But for sockeye, pink, and chum, it provides for stable access. And there's, as we discussed earlier this morning, there's a cap on the recreational harvest of sockeye coast-wide of 5% over a multi-year time period. The policy then recognizes commercial fisheries priority for sockeye, pink, and chum, given that in the past the majority of their harvest has been made up from those stocks. Just rounding that out, coho and chinook are provided when abundance permits. And then finally, it also lays out how the allocations will be distributed between the different commercial gear types. So it's a very important element of how we manage Fraser sockeye.
Thank you. Some of the previous reviews and reports that have looked into Fraser sockeye issues have identified monitoring and reporting issues as areas where improvement could be made. Could you describe what efforts are being made by DFO to improve the monitoring of and reporting in Fraser sockeye fisheries?
Fishery monitoring and catch reporting is an important element of how we manage our fisheries. Obviously, having good catch information is important as far as the assessment of where we're at relative to the total allowable catch in season. We've made a number of reforms to how we collect the information moving through time. We did release a policy paper for the commercial fishery around fishery monitoring and catch reporting. The department's continued to try and move towards enhanced accountability as part of the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative, and that's helped to support a number of elements in the various different fisheries. To give some examples, we've tried to provide alternative ways for providing harvest log information using electronic logbooks. We've also made improvements to the license conditions to, for example, in the past year to have hail in and hail out provisions, which requires the gillnet fleets now to announce when they're going out fishing and also when they're done fishing, which provides for some additional compliance auditing opportunities. And as we've moved into a number of more defined share fisheries, for example, some of our demonstration projects and economic opportunity fisheries for First Nations in the Lower Fraser, for example, we've implemented mandatory landing and dockside monitoring verification of the catches relative to their harvest shares in those fisheries.
Mr. Commissioner, I know this is an important area, but I did want to flag that we are doing a section in the hearings on both commercial and recreational issues, including catch monitoring and changes, improvements, et cetera, in catch issues. So it's important to flag it, but I'm a little bit concerned that we don't go too far down that road, because we will have a number of days dealing with that issue in quite a bit of detail.
Thank you, Ms. Baker, and I won't pursue that any further.
I just wanted to make one further point, and that's the department is currently working on a catch monitoring framework document that I understand is being released shortly, that we'll be seeking feedback from all our clients, and it sets out the catch monitoring principles that we would look to have in place across all fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Rout. And I'm very mindful of Ms. Baker's very astute point that a lot of this is going to be the subject of further hearings. So I'm trying to keep it at a very high level, but I want to give Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, as two of DFO's more experienced fisheries managers, an opportunity to at least provide an overview on some of these issues, but I'll be as brief as I can. On that note, Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, other fisheries models and terminal fisheries, just a couple of questions. First, could you describe why commercial fisheries on the coast of British Columbia are where they are?
A lot of that's historical. If you turn back the clock to 300 years or whatever it might be, most of the commercial fisheries were inland, where they were providing there were fish that were being provided to fur trading companies and new settlers or whatever into the various areas. So a lot of the harvest was occurring in rivers in various places. But starting in the mid-1800s, there were canneries and salting facilities being established, and most of those were near the mouths of rivers, because they were trying to provide fish that was going to Europe or other places. And so where they became established is where the majority of the fisheries were. So in that era, most of the fish was harvested near the mouth of the river, near terminal areas. And then over time, as fleets developed in capacity and boats being able to move about the coast, essentially industrialization, so having motors that are relying on sails and being towed around and whatnot, fleets began to be able to go out and seek out the fish instead of waiting for the fish to come back to a given location. And so where they were successful in that endeavor with different fisheries change things. So, we've gone through primarily gillnet to traps at given times, to the troll, seine, gillnet that are the primary commercial fisheries today that have high degree of mobility, to where they're at. So we're trying to move away from just some of that history at this point and trying to establish fisheries that are much more focused to these broader wild salmon policy principles and sustainability. And so that's why we're looking at trying to move some of these fisheries back into more terminal areas in recent years with our demonstration fisheries at this stage, but trying to make some of that kind of transition. And in a number of fisheries, in particular around the Fraser, some of the harvesting years recently and some of the periods of review when there was significant harvesting in, for example, of Guayanas and Troll North Coast, some seining North Coast, Reynolds Sound, Purple Bluff, which I'm not certain if that's just a local name, but it's in the Central Coast Bella Bella area, west coast of Vancouver Island. Those fisheries often occurred at a time well in advance of much of the assessment fisheries testing done by the Pacific Salmon Commission or the department. And given the uncertainties in returns and the variability of returns in years, in the last 15, 20 years, many of those fisheries are curtailed. And in one case, we have a request from the Pacific Salmon Commission to not fish too far away from the assessment points because of the added uncertainty that it's creating. So we're trying to move the fish more terminally generally to try to be more confident in run sizes and be more make appropriate decisions.
Some testimony regarding what's known as the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative, or PICFI for short, and also, as I understand it, Pacific Fisheries Reform. Could you describe what each of those two initiatives?
Sorry, I know a PICFI will be covered again in another topic coming up. I'm just a little bit concerned about how we could end up doing several weeks of hearings in what we only have is a couple of days. So
I appreciate that, Ms. Baker, and I'll skip that question. If I could ask that Exhibit 185 be brought up. This is a document. It's titled A Fishery Decision-Making Framework Incorporating the Precautionary Approach. Mr. Grout, Mr. Rosenberg, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am.
Could you describe how it is influencing the management of Fraser sockeye fisheries?
Well, this document is a document that guides the management of fisheries in Canada. In terms of Pacific salmon, it does specifically reference the wild salmon policy as the way we're going to implement the precautionary approach in salmon fisheries. And really the intention is to take into account uncertainties and specify reference points that are going to be used in the management of the resource. The Fraser Sockeye Spawning Initiative in particular is making use of harvest rules that have the similar elements to the rules laid out in the precautionary approach framework, in that we've got reference point below which we're going to have minimal fishing, some increasing total allowable mortality as the run size increases, but a cap after that on the total allowed mortality to account for uncertainties, among other things. So the wild salmon policy is intended to be the vector that's used to implement the precautionary approach for Pacific salmon.
Thank you. Shift towards ecosystem-based management. Could you describe how ecosystem-based management is being reflected in the management of Fraser sockeye fisheries?
Well, there's a number of elements in the management of Fraser River sockeye that have ecosystem components to them. In some of the other fisheries the department manages, interaction between the fishery gear and other species are key considerations, and also with the habitat. With our salmon gears, for the most part, we're not impacting on the habitat of the species for the most part. There are specific examples, for example, the Area B seine fishery off the mouth of the Fraser, where we're considering boundaries that ensure the bottom of the seine nets aren't interacting with the bottom and affecting other things, juveniles of some species and crabs, for example. There's considerations around bycatch in our various fisheries. So those are species that are unintended to be caught in a fishery, but may be caught during the fisheries themselves. So a number of measures around that. The wild salmon policy also speaks to the incorporation of ecosystem status indicators as part of the overall management framework as well.
I might just add, so it's trying to bring in obviously broader objectives, and so things, whether it's Sarah species, if there became lynx, and there hasn't been that much defined around sockeye, but Fraser Chinook and killer whales, for example, are an example within the Fraser. So how we take that into account and what we do, but bring in all ocean aspects into this, so the various juvenile life stages and food sources, and those interrelationships are things that we're trying to understand better and or bring into account for where we do have knowledge.
Thank you.
That reminded me of one other thing, and that's an increasing focus on environmental variables that may assist with our management. So we've had an increasing focus on state of the oceans reports, summarizing the performance or effects on various species of various different climatic and ocean conditions. The forecast papers for Fraser River sockeye have also in the last couple of years tried to see if there's helpful variables, environmental variables that might be used in the forecasting process, be they environmental conditions themselves or indices of plankton or productivity, for example. We haven't had a lot of success so far on that, but it's one of the areas where there's been increasing focus.
My last few questions, Mr. Commissioner, relate to the Marine Stewardship Council certification process, and I'd ask that document number 8 on Canada's list of documents be brought up. This is a report in 3 volumes, which are found at tabs 8, 9, and 10 of Canada's list, and I would recommend that all 3 be marked as one exhibit, or 3 exhibits, whatever. I just think that for the record that it's important probably to have all 3 volumes of the report.
There's 3 separate documents, you say?
There are, all forming one report.
Right. It'd be marked as 343, 343A, 343B.
And if I could go to page 200 of the first volume, just to highlight the conclusion of the process, and then I'll ask you, Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, to speak a little bit about the process and some of the parties involved. But the conclusion, and this is coming from the July 2010 MSC report with respect to British Columbia sockeye fisheries, the 2 paragraphs under the heading conclusion, the TABL certification assessment team concludes that all aspects of the MSC fisheries certification methodology procedures were followed, and that 4 BC sockeye fisheries meet the requirements of the MSC principles and criteria as a well-managed and sustainable fishery. I'll just stop there, and Fraser sockeye is one of the 4 assessed fisheries, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then there's a paragraph that follows that says, which speaks to the objections, and I'll ask you a question about that in a minute, but after completion of the objection period, an independent adjudicator dismissal of the objections lodged by Watershed Watch, Salmon Society, David Suzuki Foundation, Skeena Wild Conservation Trust, Moody Marine Limited has determined that the Fraser sockeye fisheries will be certified in accordance with the Marine Stewardship Council principles and criteria for sustainable fisheries. Could you first describe just what the MSC is?
The MSC is an international process for certification of the wild capture fisheries as sustainable. And they do that by applying a rigorous framework, or scientific framework, that looks at their 3 key principles of sustainability, the environmental impact of the fishery, and the management process, and criteria related to those. And the MSC uses independent certifiers to assess the fisheries against those criteria.
And then, if I understand correctly, after the assessment there were objections and then an adjudication, is that accurate?
Throughout the process, there are opportunities for public input and comment on the process itself, and it also lays out an objection period at the end of when the report is produced as well, during which time the independent adjudicator would have to evaluate any objections that are made.
There are references in the document to the client. Who is the client through this process?
Well, the client is laid out on the front page here, and at the end of the process, it's the Canadian Pacific Sustainable Fisheries Society, which is essentially representing the commercial salmon industry.
And what's DFO's role through this process?
DFO has had quite an essential role in the process, primarily from the perspective that we're the fisheries regulator. So the assessors, the assessment team worked quite closely with the department in assessing the criteria that they use to assess the fishery.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Thank you. The next party is the province with Mr. Tyzek.
There were some slight changes in some parts of it. So in the last few years, my understanding is that it's not posted and generally not made public, but we do hand out copies of it to some individuals upon request.
So a member of the public, if they wanted to, could request it from you and they would get it?
That's correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
The Salmon Commission is not here, and the BC Public Service Alliance of Canada is not here. Rio Tinto has no questions. BC Salmon Farmers Association, I don't think they're here anymore. Seafood Producers Association is not here. Agriculture Coalition's not here. So we move down the list to the Conservation Coalition. Mr. Leadham.
Leadham, initial T, for the record, appearing as counsel on behalf of the Conservation Coalition. Gentlemen, I want to begin our discussion with respect to the planning that goes into the preseason forecast. And Mr. Grout, you mentioned and talked at length with respect to the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, the IHPC. And that's something that you chair, is it?
Yes, that committee has been chaired by the salmon team leader in past, in some years, but I'm currently chairing that committee, although there are stand-ins on occasion.
All of the meetings that take place within that committee take place with respect to the preseason planning. Is that correct?
The committee has got a planning cycle with 4 primary meetings through the year. We meet as a main IHPC group with the North and South panels in November, which is a preliminary identification of postseason issues, and it's also where we provide the salmon outlook for the coming year. We do the formal postseason reviews with the North and South committees separately in December and January, respectively, for North and South. Then we have a meeting in March to review the first draft of the IFMP, Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, followed by a final meeting in May to review that plan. And that committee does not meet in season.
That's my point, that in season there's a handoff to the Fraser River panel where the decision-making takes place. Is that right?
For Fraser sockeye, that's correct.
Right. Now, you talked at length with respect to the components of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, and you mentioned, for example, that we saw from the document that your counselor showed you that there are a number of sectors that are represented in that committee. Is that right?
That's correct.
My understanding is that part of the time there's separate meetings between Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the separate sectors. Is that correct?
Yes, the IHPC is the meeting where the various sectors come together to discuss issues of overlap and potential coordination for fisheries and concerns, but we also have a substantial consultation process outside of the IHPSC as well.
And those discussions then would be, for example, you would have a separate meeting with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board and a separate meeting with the Sport Fisheries Advisory Board. Is that correct?
Typically, there are meetings with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board and the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, as well as First Nations outside of the IHPC. In my experience at the IHPC, we've also met with the Marine Conservation Caucus on a more limited basis to review the IFMP.
Right. When you meet individually with those components of the sectors, do you ever take that information back to the plenary sessions so that everyone understands where everyone else is coming from, so to speak?
That's one of the things we try and do there. The department can summarize points of view and perspectives that we've heard from the groups at these meetings, and the groups themselves may also bring up issues that they'd like to raise with the full committee.
Now, my understanding with respect to the IFMP, the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, is that, as you suggested, there are 2 times when that actual plan is brought before the IHPC. One when it's in very rough draft form. Is that right?
That's correct. In the past, we did not have the March meeting of the IHPC, and there was some concern expressed that there wasn't enough opportunity for that committee to really have an effect on the final IFMP. So we added the March meeting as an opportunity to provide comments on the first draft.
And at that first session, then, there will be input allowed from the various sectors in terms of the pre-season forecasting and the fishing plan that's going to be developed as you approach the in-season regime. Is that correct?
That's correct. Typically at the March meeting of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, we'll have a plenary session with all of the representatives from both the North and the South. Then we also go into a more focused session on South-specific issues and North-specific issues in separate breakout rooms as well.
Right. And then you mentioned that there might be then another iteration of the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan that will come back before the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee in May.
That's correct. So prior to the March meeting, roughly a week ahead, we released draft 1 of the plan, and then approximately 1 week prior to the May meeting of the IHPC, we release a second draft of the plan to the committee, and also post it on our consultation secretariat webpage.
And then as I understand it, the IFMP then goes from that point to the minister for sign-off?
There's some steps in between where the department will be assessing the feedback that we've got from the groups. We'd meet internally to address specific issues that have been raised and make final recommendations. Then we would put together briefing material and a number of briefings. For me, particularly, I'd brief to the RDG level in the Pacific region, and then the final IFMP, as well as the briefing note, would be submitted to the minister for approval.
My understanding from reading some of the template documents and some of the material for the IFMPs is that great pains are taken to describe this as a non-binding, non-legal document. Is that your understanding as well?
Well, the IFMP is intended to lay out the key guidelines and considerations that will be used in making decisions during a fishing season. It's given all of the variables that can change in season. What we're trying to do is lay out rules that are robust to describe how we're going to react in those situations without saying we can't obviously prescribe specifically how we'll react to every single situation in the plan.
Right, but to the extent that it's binding or not, it would be your view that it's not necessarily binding. It's something that's informative and instructional, but it's not necessarily binding in and of itself. Is that fair?
Well, in cases where the department has found itself in a situation where the guidelines or the objectives laid out in the IFMP are inconsistent with the current set of information and maybe the approaches that are proposed. We have taken the approach of, for those substantive issues, to go back and brief the minister and seek approval for a different decision where appropriate.
Now, my understanding with respect to this particular, if we look at the 2009 example of the IFMP, that was in fact a document that went to the minister, and we saw earlier in your testimony, I think from Monday, that the minister signed off on that particular document. Is that correct?
That's, yeah, she signed off on the briefing note, which was approving the use of that integrated fisheries management plan.
Right. And as my recall, and I'm not sure the actual exhibit number, I believe if we can pull up tab 24 from the documents from Commission Council. I apologize, Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure the exact actual exhibit number.
I think it's Exhibit 326.
Thank you. That's the one. That's the one that was actually finalized, I believe, right? There's a note slash, it looks to be routine with note from minister. And then if you can turn to the last page of that, page 5. You'll see that there's two signatures there, one from the Deputy Minister, Ms. Dansereau, and then one from the Minister, Ms. Shea. And then there's a handwritten notation by Ms. Shea indicating need to ensure we maximize opportunities for commercial fisheries. And to the best of your knowledge, gentlemen, that handwritten note is there from the minister herself. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
We'll carry on with this panel on Monday morning, is that correct?
That's correct. We have this panel scheduled for Monday and, in fact, for Tuesday as well.
Oh, I see. It would be helpful, if it's convenient for council, just, I know she has asked before, but if you could just indicate to her your time estimates, at least for those who are here, to her before you leave. I think that would be helpful for our planning on Monday. We can revisit that on Monday morning, but that would give Ms. Baker an opportunity over the weekend to do some forward planning. Thank you very much. Have a nice
Hearing is now adjourned until Monday at 10 a.m.